Is there a volunteer who'd be willing to read either the land and labor acknowledgement for us?
I can do it, Lynette.
Oh, thank you, Robin.
Yeah, you're welcome. On behalf of Seattle Central College, I acknowledge the land on which we stand today as the traditional home of the Coast Salish people, the traditional home of all tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. Without them, we would not have access to this gathering and to this dialogue. I ask that we take this opportunity to thank the original caretakers of this land who are still here. We pause to remember that our country is built on the labor of enslaved people who were kidnapped and brought to the U.S. from the African continent, and we recognize the continuing contributions of their survivors. We acknowledge all immigrant labor, including voluntary, trafficked, coerced, and undocumented, the people who contributed to the building of this country and who continue to serve in our formal and informal labor force today. We honor all underpaid workers and unpaid caregivers, students and staff, and the invisible labor of women and faculty of color in our education. Is that educational systems? Looks like it cut off.
I'm sorry that got cut off. I'll paste the rest of it in. The last piece of that is, it is our collective responsibility to critically interrogate our histories, to repair harm, and to honor, protect, and sustain all workers. Thank you, Robin.
Thank you, Lynn.
And welcome, Dr. Gorski. Thank you for being here. All yours.
Thank you, and welcome everybody. Thanks for coming to the follow-up workshop following the keynote address. Was that a week ago? That's nuts. That does not feel like that was a week ago. Goodness. Okay. Well, welcome everybody. Good to virtually see you again. I am going to throw my PowerPoint up here. Oops, not like that though. First I need to share screen. Okay, PowerPoint. All right. All right, well, the topic that I had sort of proposed for the workshop was sustaining anti-racism momentum individually and institutionally. And maybe to have a conversation with you all or engage you all in some conversation about what that might look like. What are the tools that might help us do that, or the way of thinking about anti-racism within an institution like a college that might help us to do that. But I thought a good place to start would be, because we don't have that much time for conversation for the keynote. And I just thought I would, just in case anybody was, in case you aren't so busy that you could actually have thought about the keynote between the keynote and now. I'm just sort of curious, particularly for those of you who are at the keynote, that what has been on your mind since then? What have you been thinking about? Maybe is there anything that you've thought about or noticed since then, or maybe a concept or idea that you've been having some cognitive dissonance around or anything like that? Feel free to throw something in the chat box if you want. Or are they able to unmute and just chime in if they want to? Or feel free to unmute and chime in if you'd rather. Why do I keep doing that? Does anybody have anything? Does anybody remember a week ago?
Hi, can you all hear me?
I can, yes.
Okay. One thing that has stayed with me, and I don't remember the exact number, but it wasn't very high. It was that about, in order to move anti-racist work, you need about 20% engagement. Is that the right number? Engagement and participation?
Yes. Yeah, that's right.
Okay. And so that's something that I've been thinking a lot about, right? I think a lot of the energy and sometimes the burnout is in trying to bring along everybody to jump on that train. And it can get difficult, right? And so I've been reflecting a lot on how to refocus on the 20%.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a really important point. And part of that is about sort of the will of leadership to, feel okay about people who are choosing not to get on board with it, feeling bad because they're being left out or marginalized from the conversation. But that actually comes out of a piece of some theorizing that kind of falls under organizational change theory. And basically what it says is it's not even 20%, it's actually about 15% that what that research shows is that if about 15% of people are on board and enthusiastic, then you can create enough momentum with that 15% to pull other people along. And I think I mentioned the 20-60-20. Does that sound familiar to people? 20-60-20, did I mention that?
Yes, you did.
Yeah, which basically says that the big mistake organizations make is focusing too much of their energy on the 20% of people who are going to be resistant to the change when they ought to be focusing on the 20% of the people who are enthusiastic about the change, ready for the change. So, yeah. I think sometimes it's hard, especially for educators, to wrap our heads around, because, if I was teaching a calculus concept in a class and only 20% of students in the class understood the concept, I don't think I would just spring forward to the next thing. I would say, well, maybe we need to go over this again so more people will have the foundation for whatever the next thing is. But here we're not talking about calculus, and here we're also talking about pacing movement, when the movement is related to people suffering right now, So, yeah. Okay. Yeah, Aaron, that's a really interesting point. I think that sort of speaks to it. And then think about somebody who is in an institution where they're experiencing oppression or marginalization, whether it's racism or cisgenderism or whatever it is. Well, some of you don't have to imagine that because you've experienced, but imagine being that person and then sitting through conversations that are just sort of tiptoeing around it, and it's like, at some point, are we going to have a real conversation here? So, anyone else? Anything that you've been sort of thinking about or carrying with you or reflecting on? Just give us the new stuff. We can do the new stuff. Okay. All right. Well, if anything comes up, then feel free to pop it in the chat box. So last time I got us rolling on content with a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. And this time I'm going to do a quote by James Baldwin. I have all these quotes. Actually, later I just love these quotes. Later, I actually have one from Audre Lorde. So it's just like, I feel bad. I feel like I'm exploiting the labor of people by using their quotes in my workshops. But but I think they're good, just sort of conversation starters. So James Baldwin says, "What is it that you want me to reconcile myself to? You always told me it takes time. It has taken my father's time, my mother's time, my uncle's time, my brother's and my sister's time, my nieces and my nephew's time. How much time do you want for your progress?" And so here's what I want to reflect on. What is, sort of building on this notion of the pacing, at whose pace are we moving these efforts? What do you think, what is James Baldwin challenging us to think about here? What do you think the challenge is that we could take from what James Baldwin has to say here?
Perhaps a part of it is about it's not about time. It's more about white folks being willing to change, and it's not about a lack of knowledge or information shared by folks of color. It's white folks that need to be putting in work.
Yeah, absolutely, and great comments popping up here on the chat box as well. There's real impact and harm occurring while we're taking our time. It's like, as we casually saunter toward anti-racism, who bears the brunt of our casualness there, right? I also like that point about passing it to the next generation, because sometimes I think people have this misperception. People are always like, well, the next generation has this figured out, that sort of thing. And it's never true. It never turns out to be true. But it's like I always hear that. It's like, well, my kids have a very racially diverse group of kids. So so racism's not going to be an issue, that sort of thing. And it just never turns out that way. But yeah, so, we can't keep waiting. But I think there's also something here about something that we will be talking about today, which is a distinction between a sort of a baby steps approach, or what we sometimes call a mitigative approach, and a transformative approach. And a mitigative approach is like, the question is, does making a curriculum at the college a little less racist, is that real progress? Or is making something, slightly less transphobic, is that progress? Or is the only progress making it anti-racist, making it anti-cisgenderist, rather than the sort of incremental change, and who are the increments for, it's kind of like that thing I think I talked about last time, like the baby steps. It's like at some point we need to trade the baby steps for some big leaps. What are the big anti-racist leaps, rather than the little, diversity and inclusion type kind of baby steps. So we're going to sort of engage around that a little bit more today. So before we do that, just a really quick review. We're not going to spend much time on this, because it's just a review of what we did last time. But remember, we're looking for goodwill, the desire for justice, but we also want, layered on top of that, depth of knowledge, understanding how racism operates and how to cultivate anti-racism. But even that doesn't totally get us there. We also want a commitment to action. What's the action? The philosophy doesn't help without the action. The community dialogue is not the action. The community dialogue is what prepares us for the action. The question is, what is the actual anti-racist action? What is the action? Right, so we need all three of those. We need all three of those. And we talked about a definition for racism that is structural and accumulative by nature, where we realize anti-bias training doesn't quite get us all the way there, that we also need kind of a systems view, understanding racism as systems of advantage and disadvantage, or systems of advantage and oppression based around race. And if we really want to make an impact, we have to understand how those systems are operating and how to interrupt those systems. We talked about 6 layers of racism, and particularly connected the ideological with the institutional in a bigger context of the structural. And I still think that that's, if I can develop a consciousness around anti-racism that connects the ideological with the institutional within an understanding of the structural, then I position myself to have institutional impact. We talked about some common, what we call equity detours, racial equity detours. We talked about some basic equity principles, racial equity principles, and that's sort of where we left it. So this week we're going to build on that. And I'm going to introduce a couple more, I guess you could say they're kind of like conceptual tools, but we're going to spend more time this time actually applying them. We'll go into breakout rooms and apply them to your college. Seattle Central College will apply them to your college and sort of pivot toward, okay, well, what does it look like if we're doing this well and doing it effectively? The place I want to start this is with a little bit of Evelyn Young wrote this article where she talked about the 4 persona of racism and educational leadership. She wrote a lot about the K-12 education, but this little kind of conceptual tool that she developed, I think is actually quite helpful, especially in addressing one piece of something we talked a little bit last week. I think I mentioned last week, actually, I'm sure I mentioned last week, that my experience has been that sometimes the most challenging institutions of higher ed to really get a foothold on anti-racism, to really get momentum on anti-racism, is not so much the places where, there's a lot of rabid, outspoken racists, but sometimes those are the places that are, have the biggest sort of concentration of liberalish sort of diversity celebrating white people. And the challenge in places like that is not usually a lack of different initiatives and cool sounding programs and neat sort of anti-racism classes and that sort of thing. But usually the challenge is a lack of something more substantive institutionally or some ideological blockages. And Evelyn Young talks a little bit about that. She talks about these 4 persona. I really want to talk about number 3, because I think that's where that kind of white liberalism shows up. But she talks about these 4. One, she talks about conscious perpetrators. These are people who intentionally participate in racism. They know that they're racist, they're intentionally racist, that sort of thing. Those people exist in every institution, including your institution. And maybe they're less prevalent at your institution than some other institutions. Maybe not, I'm not sure. But they exist everywhere. But again, my experience is, in an institution like yours, that's not generally the biggest blockage. The second group she talks about is unconscious perpetrators, people who don't have bad intentions, but they don't actively resist racism, and they participate in racism without that sort of malice of intention. So these are people who might come across as nice and kind people, but are still perpetuating racism. And of course, every institution has people like this. But this is the group that I really want to talk about here, is the deceived perpetrators. Evelyn Young describes them as people who passionately engage against racism, but are, quote unquote, blinded by false idealism that disrupts their abilities to really lead for anti-racism. And again, this to me connects to the thing we talked about last week, which is what people often call white liberalism or white liberal anti-racism, that sort of thing. This sort of blinded by false idealism, where the perception is we're much further along than we actually are. And that might be for the individual, that might also be for the institution. And I find that in organizations that at least have the kind of reputation your college has, to often be a pretty substantial block, that people get invested in the perception of the institution as being really progressive or anti-racist or whatever, that the sort of hard work of anti-racism is just not quite there the way it needs to be. And we're going to come back to that point on the next slide. And then there's enlightened perpetrators, recognize structural racism, but realize no matter how hard they fight racism, they're still tied to the system of racial oppression. And I think that's sort of connected to a question, if I remember correctly, that came up last week, where somebody said, in essence, I think the question was something like, is it possible really to be an anti-racist institution that sits in a societal context that's full of racism? And this is what might cause burnout for individual people, which is like, it feels like we're constantly in an uphill battle here. But I want to go back to number 3, and this is what I want to ask you all. We're not going to go into small groups for this because we're going to do that for a couple other things. But just I would love just to hear some people's thoughts about this. Feel free to throw something in the chat box. What does this false idealism sound and look like? When people embrace this kind of false idealism, what are the things that they say? What are the things they might do, that they think of as anti-racist that might not really quite be anti-racist? I don't see color. Definitely could be. One thing my organization has done a lot of is these equity assessments or anti-racist assessments of various kinds of educational institutions. And even the ones that are sort of have the reputation for being pretty progressive, what we often find is, through survey data, is that on average, white people have a very elevated perception of how well the institution is doing around matters of equity and justice, much more elevated than BIPOCs or people of color do at the same institution. So that's that sort of groupthink false idealism. Heather, I think that's a great example. Good example, Aaron. Yeah. So I think, again, we can all reflect on this individually, but what I also would challenge you all to think about is what reflecting on this institutionally would look like. Like, how does this false idealism operate institutionally? I know I mentioned I taught at George Mason University, and one thing that was happening there that sort of reflected this is that the university really used the data about the diversity, student diversity at the institution. I think one year George Mason was named the most racially diverse college or university in the country. I don't know what the metrics are for that, but there was this sort of false conflation that that being diverse is somehow the same as being equitable and just. And of course, it's not the same. And the university put together this thing called the Diversity Research Group, and charged that group with collecting data and publishing studies about how diverse George Mason University was. And I got invited into the Diversity Research Group. In my first meeting there, I said, it feels like all we're measuring is how diverse we are. And I said, that doesn't feel as meaningful as trying to get a sense of how equitable and just we are. And I was never invited back to the Diversity Research Group after that. So, but that's because I was interrupting this false idealism. Yeah. So the question is, if the false idealism is really about people wanting to grab onto some kind of hope or feel good about the efforts that are happening, the question is, well, how do we prepare ourselves to be able to have this kind of hope and some level of commitment without embracing these conflations and false idealism, you know? And we'll sort of work through some of that today. I see there's a lot of stuff coming up in the chat box. It's kind of rolling a little quicker than I can keep track of. So if anybody was like posting questions in there that I missed, somebody might just alert me to that so I can go back and look at the questions.
Yeah, we're watching for questions.
Oh, okay, thank you. Thanks. Okay, so I want to go back now. So, okay, well, how do we do that? I want to go back now to something we touched on just briefly last time when I said I was going to expand on it this time, and that's the 5 abilities. We call them the 5 abilities of equity literacy, strengthening our literacy around equity, justice, anti-racism, other kinds of anti-oppression work, which we see as sort of a pathway. You know, a lot of institutions we work with, again, sort of another conflation that we often see is a conflation with approaches that are really individual focused, like anti-bias or like, having individual white people pour the contents of our white privilege knapsacks on the floor and kind of rifle through them, mistaking that for something for a set of knowledge and skills that's more institutional. And the challenge is I can be in touch with my own bias, right? Or at least I can be sort of on my way to being in touch with my own bias. But that's not the same as being able to recognize how subtle racism is operating in a policy. It's not the same as understanding how racism is built into institutional culture. That's a whole different set of skills. It's a different set of knowledge. And we need both of those sets of knowledge. But because that sort of anti-bias approach is the one that tends to be really popular, the sort of abilities that we've built into our approach are really more, they have individual implications, but they're really more about how we can affect institutionalized institutional change. So you'll remember there's 5 abilities here. And I'll talk about each one of these sort of briefly. And then after we do that, I'm going to send you all into groups have some conversation using these 5 abilities. So the first ability you'll remember is the ability to recognize inequity, to recognize racism. Do I recognize even the subtlest bias and racism in my sphere of influence? Do I know how to recognize it? And what's required there is to actually, I think I said this last time, but the challenge is that people tend to be really good at recognizing the kinds of inequity and oppression that impact us directly, but are not always that good at recognizing the kinds that impact other people and in turn create that advantage for me, that advantage disadvantage piece there. So sometimes what I have to do is just literally work on recognizing it. And then we always talk about this as the most important ability because I can't eliminate racism that I don't recognize as racism. I can't respond to or redress, those are the other abilities, racism that I don't recognize as racism. So that's our first step. And we actually have to, some of you I'm sure are really good at this. Some people already have to know how to do this just to survive an institution, right? This is something that we have to practice, consciously practice. So you might think of, we're going to do a bigger group exercise. This is just a little quick reflection here. So you might think, what is an example of racism that you've seen operating that you worry that most people don't recognize as racism? What would be an example of that? Something you recognize as racism, but maybe the institution itself doesn't recognize it yet as racism, or other people try to explain it away or don't recognize it as racism. Let me think of an example of that. Y'all came up with some good examples last week. I made you use up all your examples last week. What is the way racism operates at your college that most people would not necessarily recognize or call it racism because they don't recognize it as racism? Can we think of an example of that? Okay, thanks, Emily. Now, here's the thing about embracing anti-racism and committing to anti-racism is that if I don't have this first ability, if I can't exercise this first ability, then I'm not going to be able to do this. I'm not going to be able to do this. So remember we talked last week about really the first step is this step, mapping out all the ways racism operates, even if it's little subtle ways, even if it's big, huge, obnoxious ways. And that's sort of what you're doing now in the chat box. Yeah. Yeah, interesting examples here, interesting examples. So then a next question is, if there are examples of this, what are people who don't recognize it as racism? What are they misunderstanding? What are they not seeing about it? What is the misunderstanding? What is the thing people are missing? Because, the purpose of that question is, if I'm going to help move people along, then I have to be right on top of what it is that people are misunderstanding. Some people are just don't want to talk about the existence of racism at all. I'm talking about people who are willing to be engaged, but they just don't have the ability to recognize it, and sort of what are they missing? And then the next question is, how can you help them recognize it as racism? So again, when we get to the end of these 5 abilities, there'll be a group exercise for you all to do. So you'll be able to come back to some of these questions. The second ability, now the key here to these 5 abilities is being able to distinguish ability 2 and ability 3. So let's focus on these two abilities for a second. Ability number 2 is responding to inequity in the context of what we're talking about, responding to racism. When racism becomes apparent in a particular instance, do I have the skills and the will to respond to it? Now, one important distinction here, and this is part of the sort of tenets of critical race theory. An important distinction, my friend Marceline talks about these instances, the instance when racism becomes apparent. She calls them flare-ups. And I think that's really important because one thing we have to remember is that institutional racism is operating all the time. It's not just a series of individual events. It's always operating. If it's built into a policy, it's always operating. If it's in institutional culture or in practices or procedures, it's as long as those things are operating, it's always operating. It's always operating. It's always operating through people's ideologies. It's always, so when we talk about these instances, we don't mean that, okay, there's no racism and no racism and no racism, and then suddenly there's racism. And what do we do about the racism? What we're talking about is sort of the flare up of the racism that always exists, or, when it sort of, punches people in the chin who, aren't forced because of racism to recognize how it's always operating. So respond is what we do in the moment. Right? Somebody says, wow, that policy is really unjust. Say, okay, well, maybe we change the policy. Or somebody makes a deficit remark about a certain group of students and we engage that person in a conversation. It's what we do in the immediate term to respond to an instance of flare-up of racism. How do we respond to it? Okay, so that's in the moment. The third ability, this is where the institutional rubber meets the proverbial institutional road, or maybe it's the rubber that's proverbial and not the road. I'll have to think about that. But this is the deeper work. And this, I think, is the big leap for a lot of people. And that's from responding to inequity to redressing it, from responding to instances of racism to redressing racism, to yanking it out by its roots. So redress is about, recognizing, first of all, that those individual instances or flare-ups are part of this thing that's always operating. So we have to address the thing that's always operating. So what are the root causes? So I think I shared an example like this last time, but let's say there's some sort of procedure or practice or policy, and someone says, yeah, that really has disproportionate negative impact on Indigenous students or Black students or whoever it might be. So we say, okay, well, we need to change that policy or practice. That's the respond. But the redress is, what was the thinking that ever went into the creation of this policy or practice? Like, what is it about institutional culture that ever landed us on this procedure? What was the thinking? What were the ideological blockages? What were the structural blockages that ever landed us here? Because if all we do is change the one policy or practice, the thinking that went into making that practice racist is still going to exist and is still going to be applied to all these other things. So we want to get at the underlying stuff there. And again, you're going to practice this. You're going to practice this in a second. Okay. So you can go think about an example of, racism that you recognize and say, okay, well, what are the root causes of that? How did that end up? What are I asked about what was the misunderstanding that, you know, and that's what you want to dig into. What was, you know, how did institutional culture and leadership allow that to happen? You know, what was the mangled thinking that went into it, right? Okay. The fourth ability is actively cultivate equity, or in our case, what we're talking about, actively cultivate anti-racism. So this is moving forward. Do we have the knowledge and the skills and the will to make sure we're applying an anti-racist lens to every discussion? We need to preempt the respond and the redress moving forward. And so let's make sure we're thinking about a new policy or a new practice. Remember that the prioritization principle that we talked about last time. You know, every policy, if we're taking an anti-racist approach, we say, okay, well, how are we prioritizing the best interests, the joys, the access of BIPOC students, BIPOC faculty, staff, community members, whoever it is, you know, actively cultivate. So we are applying this lens and this commitment to everything moving forward. Instead of doing this sort of, I think of it as like that whack-a-mole game, like whack an injustice, that kind of the respond does, like something pops up and it's like, boom, we'll respond to that. Something else pops up, is like, boom. Well, you know, once something has popped up, that, you know, that means the damage is already being done. The damage has been done. So how do we preempt that moving forward? By making sure we're applying this commitment to everything we do. And then finally, it's sustain anti-racism efforts, sustain equity, sustain anti-racist efforts. And we know as we progress toward that deep anti-racist commitment, that, you know, people who have grown entitled to having extra access and opportunity are going to complain, or they're going to try to slow or reverse the progress, that 20%, you know, of resistors, even if they aren't outright rabid racist kind of resistors, you know, even if they're people who just resist any kind of change. So the question then is, do I know how to sustain these efforts even in the face of the pushback? You know, this kind of reminds me of one time I was in a taxi going from the airport to it's actually a school district in New Jersey, a K-12 district. And I was talking to the taxi driver, and it just so happened that he formerly was a student in this district. And he asked me, well, you know, what are you doing with the district? And I said, well, they hired us to come and do this anti-racist work. And he said, oh man, there are going to be a lot of people there who aren't happy to see you. And so we talked about that, and and then he said, excuse my language, he said, well, if you don't piss anyone off, then you're not doing anti-racism hard enough. I thought, you know, that needs to be the new slogan for my organization, you know. But it's so right, you know, it's so right that in an institution committed to anti-racism, the loudest anti-racist voices should feel like the center of institutional culture. And the most resistant voices should literally feel marginalized from institutional culture. They should wonder whether they belong there. But often what happens is the reverse. The people who are the most committed are like, I do not feel like I belong at this place, at this, you know. It should, in essence, feel hostile to people who are hostile to anti-racism. You know, they should be like, I need to find another job, you know, and you say, okay, yeah, that's a good idea. But institutions that claim a commitment to this are rarely willing to commit to that level. rarely willing, and there's a lot of explaining away of damage. So, okay. So what I want to do is we're going to go into some breakout rooms. I'm going to give you about 15 minutes, which is not going to feel like enough time, to do a little exercise. Then we'll take a break. Then we'll come back and process the exercise a little bit. And then we'll go on to the next thing. So here's what I want you to do in the breakout rooms. You'll be in groups of 5 or 6, I think. So I want you to sort of take what I asked you to do earlier, but as a group, I want you to pick one example. And your picking of the example is the recognize. But then what I want you to think about is, especially what would responding to it, like if you wanted the change that you can make in the immediate term, what would that be? And then I want you to talk about the redress. What would that look like? What are the root causes? What is the thing that's holding this example of racism in place? And what are you going to do about that? What could be done about that? Then I want you to think about actively cultivate. Okay, moving forward, what are some values or some principles that we could put into place so as we move forward related to whatever thing you're talking about, that every decision we make now is going to be an anti-racist decision, so we don't have to come back to this in another 5 or 10 years. Okay, so I really want you to focus on those middle 3: respond, redress, actively cultivate. We'll come back. We're not going to have time for everybody to report out, but we'll ask a couple groups to report out. So identify somebody who might report out. But it's still important just to go through these steps. And again, especially to be able to practice the respond and the redress. Especially the key here is the redress. That's where deeper institutional change happens. So, okay. So if we can go ahead, we'll give them 15 minutes